Welcome to Unlapped. I'm Laurence Edmondson, joined alongside Nate Saunders to break down the latest news cycle from around the grid ahead of our final race of the season in Abu Dhabi. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's get into this. Nate, big news at the start of this week. I was flying back from Qatar, but you managed to get a pretty big news story, and it is all around Checo Perez and his future beyond this weekend's Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. I'm just going to let you take it away. What do you know? What's the situation once the flag drops in Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, well, I'm always loath to say with confidence we know what's happening with Red Bull's driver program because that has been the one thing this year we haven't known. But yeah, sources that we know have told us that Red Bull have now come to that conclusion that after the season he's had, especially after the recent races he's had, that I think Checo Perez is done. Out at the end of the season. Obviously, until that's confirmed, we can't say for certainty that it's been gone. I remember we went into the summer break a little less certain that he was kind of going to be gone, but we had a degree of certainty going in there that there might be a driver switch taking place, which looking back on now is remarkable because a few races later, Ricardo was gone from the junior team even. But it seems that the mindset has shifted from it being likely to very likely to being nailed on. And from what I understand, after Abu Dhabi, Perez will meet with Helmut Marko and Christian Horner. They'll discuss the season, which is what they do with every driver at Red Bull, at the end of the year. But I think with him as well, what they will do is they'll look at his contract and they'll say, right, we are moving you on from the team. And this is where potentially it gets messy, where it could get complicated. But we've talked a lot about Red Bull contracts before. You're technically contracted to Red Bull, the company, rather than Red Bull Racing. And that is what Red Bull ultimately will point to. Is it's the same thing that allowed them to move on from Daniel Ricciardo. It's the same thing that allowed them to move on from Nick De Vries. It's the same thing that's allowed them to switch drivers between teams in the past. You are an employee of Red Bull, and there's no obligation to put you into either race seat. And I believe as well after Abu Dhabi with this new contract when it kicks in, that is something that can be enforced in a new way because obviously Perez signed an extension earlier this year, an extension which is still kind of baffling to think that he got, given the fact that even when he got it, he wasn't driving that well. But he at least was driving maybe a slight bit better than he has been now. I think he had a few podiums under his belt. So that's what's changed. So I think it may well drag into the new year before we get an actual confirmation of that. But there were all kinds of things flying around, even in Las Vegas. And remember, we were talking scenarios that maybe they'd let him race the start of the next season, see if he triggered some clauses. But I think he's been so costly in the car this year. I mean, we're going to a race weekend where McLaren and Ferrari are fighting for the constructors. Red Bull think at the very least they should be in that fight, and you look at the maths of it, they absolutely should be. And I think that they've reached a point where they don't think they're going to get the old Sergio Perez back. The Sergio Perez that showed glimpses over especially the first two seasons. Winning a couple of races, but also it wasn't just about winning races, was it? It was about being a strong number two to Max at most times, and there's no shame in that. Max is the best driver in the world right now, and Sergio Perez just has not been able to do that. And with the field closing up like that, he's been exposed. So whether or not they can find someone who can do better will be another story, and I think will be a narrative of next season. But I think, the patience is broken, and the patience has got to a point where time is up. So this could well be the final race of Perez's career this weekend. We'll see what happens. He'll probably be on a sabbatical next season, unless he does something crazy like take a swap deal and go to the junior team, which someone suggested to me on Twitter. But I think we both know Sergio Perez well enough to know that that wouldn't be the case, that he wouldn't want to do that. So yeah, pretty interesting weekend, and I'm fascinated to know what he will say this weekend when we put the question to him, because he's kind of evaded it, hasn't he, for weeks and weeks now. He said, I'll be driving in the car next year. And I'm sure that will still be what he says on Thursday and media day. But long-winded way there, Laurence, of saying, I don't believe, well, we know now for a fact that Red Bull do not want him to be in the car next season, which is a big change.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing. What's been said on the record, and then what we kind of know is going on behind the scenes now. Because you're right, Checo has said, I've got a contract for 2 years. I've no intention of breaking it. I'm going to be racing. When Christian was asked about it in Qatar, Christian Horner, the team principal in Qatar, he said I'm going to let Checo come to his own conclusion. Nobody's forcing him one way or another. It's not a nice situation for him to obviously be in. And then he later
Yeah,
said he's old enough and wise enough to know what the situation is. And yeah, let's see where we are after Abu Dhabi. And so this old enough and wise enough thing was basically, it seemed to me like saying, well, Checo knows the writing's on the wall. He's going to make the right decision and move. But it also suggested to me, like you were saying, under this contract, it seems they can't even say we're getting rid of him at this stage.
that seems
Otherwise,
to be it. Yeah,
why drag it out? And I think it's also saying to Checo, look, if you want to say goodbye to everyone properly, what will likely be your final race, you have the opportunity to do it, but the choice is there with you. But yeah, it does seem perhaps once we move out of this year contract into next year's contract that things change a bit. The other thing, just to pick up on
oh
what
god,
you're
yeah.
saying about his underperformance this year, I mean, Max has scored 429 points, obviously won the title in Las Vegas. Perez has scored 152 points. He's eighth in the standings, but the stat that really hit this home to me, I mean, anyone can do the maths on that and see the difference, but he's closer to the bottom of the standings, zero. There's a few drivers still on 0 points, including poor old Valtteri Bottas after the race in Qatar. He's closer to that by some margin than he is to his teammate Max Verstappen with
Which is insane, isn't
429
it?
points. And
Just
so,
insane.
I mean, do you think in a way, this decision is Red Bull's hands been forced just by his performance because they're not in the constructors fight this weekend in Abu Dhabi, and that's a title that they were going into this year defending, and they started the season looking like they had the performance to keep it.
Yeah, I really do. I think that around USA Mexico time when we had that double header, there was a real hope that, if he can kick on, especially at home, there was that real feeling when we were in Mexico, if he can just conjure something up here, it can kick on. And yeah, I always felt that the desire, especially from Christian Horner, was that they didn't have to make this decision, that Perez would kick on, things would be okay. And I think that there's a growing feeling that A, yes, they should be in this constructors fight. B, next year could be even tighter. If Mercedes are closer up there. I mean, you imagine that situation where you've got Max fighting for the championship next year and Red Bull maybe dropping to fourth. And a lot is made, I think, of the money that Perez brings with him. And it is substantial that he brings to Mexico, but there's prize money being lost here. And I don't know exact numbers, but when you talk to people at Red Bull, they will tell you that also, and this is the case for every team, isn't it? It's not just the constructors' prize money, but it's the money that the sponsors are tied to Red Bull as well. If they're finishing first versus third, suddenly the money they're getting from Oracle comes down, the money they're getting from all their partners comes down per their contracts. So at the end of the season, they're probably looking at it and thinking, we are so much worse off now than we would have been. And we're in a cost cap era. It's not like Red Bull is hard up for money, but these teams want to make money and they want, they need to be generating money for these operations to run. So yeah, to your point, I think performance has been a big thing. On what you were saying there about he knows, the reality of the situation. I think there's been an interesting dynamic going on for a while. We saw stories kind of filtering out around Mexico time again that he would retire. Perez said no. And now I'm not accusing anyone of leaking this stuff, but it does seem that Red Bull would like him to do that. It's almost like, hey, do the honorable thing and retire for us. And Perez, to his credit, is turning around and said, well, no, like I signed a contract with you guys. I'm owed money next season. I wanna, I wanna see out that contract, which any normal human being would do. So that's definitely not a dig on Perez there for not wanting to retire. But I think you're right. I think there's definitely a sense that this is on Checo now to do the right thing. We saw that Red Bull can be kind of fairly callous about getting rid of their drivers just a couple months ago when Ricciardo left. The way he went, the way he wasn't even kind of allowed. Was he allowed to say it? Maybe he did know more than he let on at the time. It seems from various places, but yeah, I do think performances have just shifted this. And the other interesting part of that as well is that I think now they've realized that if they keep Perez in that seat next season, that this mess is doubly troublesome because you've got Isaac Hadjar waiting in the wings. You'd have to promote him late in middle of a season, early in a season. You'd put Lawson up there a few races in. It wouldn't be the ideal way. The best way to do it, if it is Lawson, I think it will be Lawson, is to do it before testing in the off season, give everybody a full season in the new situation and work it out. But yeah, I think that I think is why it's changed so dramatically over the last two races, because Perez was pretty poor in that triple header with Mexico in it. this last two races, he's just been awful. He's just been nowhere. So I think that that's just really hammered it home to everyone.
Yeah, just let's pick up on what happens next, assuming Perez isn't there in 2025. You just mentioned two key names. Liam Lawson, who I think most people will be familiar with, moved into RB again this year, replacing Daniel Ricciardo, after he also replaced him last year when Ricciardo broke his hand. And Isaac Hadjar, who people might not be so familiar with, but Formula 2 driver, half a point off the lead of the F2 Championship going into the final round, fighting Gabriel
Yeah,
Bortoleto. Of
super
course,
tight.
got the yeah, very tight, and yeah, Bortoleto, who's got the Sauber drive for next year. So two promising young drivers. Of course, Antonelli, who we know is going to Mercedes, is also in that championship. Ollie Behrman, who's going to Haas, is also in that championship. So these guys have shown themselves to be pretty good. So is that what you've heard is going to happen? That Lawson is most likely to get the Red Bull seat, Hadjar likely to replace him at RB? Because a lot of people would say, wait a minute, Yuki Tsunoda, where does
Yeah.
he fit into this? And then there'll also be people who I think a couple of weeks ago would have read some stuff about Franco Colapinto and thought, well, maybe he could get a drive in RB if the Perez thing moves on.
Yeah, I think it will be Lawson, and I'm in two minds about that because I'm with you, Laz. I think that Yuki just for years now has seemed like the obvious candidate. He's especially this year he's made such a an effort to kind of I think he says he pushes the radio button less now, doesn't he? He doesn't try and swear down the radio so much. I think he's very conscious of the fact that the way he maybe comes across through the broadcast maybe isn't what Red Bull are looking for. So I think for whatever reason, Red Bull, Christian Horner just isn't convinced he's the guy. I think that Helmut Marko would happily put either of those guys into the top team, and I think Horner can stomach Lawson going up there. I don't think he could stomach Tsunoda going up there. And as for Colapinto, that's a really interesting one as well, because again, to go back a few races, it seemed like a cert that he was going to go to either Red Bull or to Alpine a few races ago. Red Bull as a driver, probably for the junior team, so that one of those guys could go up, or Alpine to kind of replace Doohan as their reserve driver and be waiting in the wings for a future drive there. The last three races, a bit like we were saying with Perez, it seems to have really shifted the narrative on Colapinto. Two really expensive crashes, Brazil and Vegas. I think you could maybe have chalked Brazil down to the rain. But then you look at Vegas, I mean, it was such a rookie error and such an expensive crash, and probably the worst time that Franco Colapinto could have done that. I think that there were already some reservations. I think that I heard somebody at Alpine say one of the fears people had was that, are we just being kind of suckered into this hype train about this young driver? And then he crashes twice, and I think suddenly it sends a spark, it kind of flicks a switch in people's heads of like, let's step back a little bit here. This guy's had what, 8 races in Formula One. We've seen some very good performances. We've seen some pretty, shaky rookie performances as well. So I think it's cooled the hype train a little bit on him. I actually still think Colapinto deserves a seat in Formula One. I'd love to see him race there. But it's just unfortunate for him those things happen when they did, because they seem to have kind of slammed the door shut for him. And I think as well, a big thing with Colapinto is Helmut Marko, especially since Mateschitz passed away a few years ago. There's been a real desire for the junior team to be the place where Red Bull juniors go to make Formula One. And I think that there was a feeling that just signing Colapinto would really undermine Hadjar, who, like you say, could be Formula 2 champion this weekend. And also would basically be another, them admitting like, well, our driver kind of pathway is wrong. A bit like what happened when they signed Perez, to be honest with you, a few years ago. They signed Perez because they didn't have a junior driver they thought could go up against Max in a title winning car, support Max in a title winning car. So I think there's a bit of that to it as well. And we can get into Colapinto on another day, but there's all sorts of fascinating things with negotiations with his team and stuff like that. I like Colapinto, but you get the feeling that his whole team around him are kind of struggling to deal with this newfound fame they've got at the moment. And I think a lot of people, when they're talking to him, are a bit like, oh, okay, some red flags there that maybe we'll leave for the time being. So I can see. I mean, what do you think will happen with Colapinto? I imagine he'll just stay on the side with Williams for a year, and then he kind of will just be that guy that there's always a close-up shot of every time someone goes in the gravel or hits the wall. It'll be like, here, this guy's not racing. Because Lawson was kind of like that, wasn't he? Whenever Ricciardo did anything, it was zooming on Lawson. I guess Colapinto, if he's in the Williams garage, there'll just be a camera right next to him all season next year if that is the case.
Yeah, Football One will designate that cameraman, that pit lane cameraman who does the close-ups to him, most likely. But I think it'd be a real shame. I mean, the thing is, when you have a rookie driver, you've got to accept that there's going to be accidents like that, especially in conditions like they were in Brazil or on a street circuit like Las Vegas. I agree the Las Vegas crash looked particularly clumsy, but these things do happen. And if you talk to Toto Wolff about Kimi Antonelli, I think Toto Wolff is convinced that Kimi Antonelli is a future champion and
Mm.
the best possible driver they could have once Lewis decided to move on, long term. Um, and yet they're expecting him to make mistakes. So it comes as a package, and I find it surprising that these drivers' stocks can rise so high and fall so quickly in such a short period of time. But then you look at the decision makers, and Red Bull do have this tendency to jump on a hype train or jump off it. I mean, Nick De Vries being a very obvious example. He had that one great race with Williams where he subbed in for Alex Albon, and then next year he was in an AlphaTauri, and then quite soon he was out in AlphaTauri. And so, and look, someone like Helmut Marko, his judgment on drivers is very good. If you look at his track record, of course, world champions, Max Verstappen, he managed to get on board, and of course, Seb Vettel before that. So, but I just feel sometimes like with a lot of these drivers, it's so brutal. It's so like there's so much pressure on them. And I actually felt Colapinto was dealing with it really well up
Same.
until these recent races. But I don't think that should detract from, say, his Baku performance, where he scored points on whatever it was, his second race, and just that ability to really just jump in a car with minimal testing. Remember, he had one like FP1 in Silverstone and then was thrown into it in Monza and performed the way he did. I thought was exceptional, and I think that really did say something about him as a driver. So I would be very upset if, and I don't think it will be the end of his F1 career, but if it is, I think that would be brutally unfair. But then you've also got to look at it from the other guy's perspective. Like you say, Hadjar done a great job in F2 up until the point that Colapinto left F2 this year. Hadjar was ahead of him, and then you got to look at, say, Jack Doohan. I mean, all that talk of Colapinto's. So Alpine's interest in Colapinto, Jack Doohan must have been sat there thinking, well, wait a minute, where's he going? Are they going to put the pressure on me for next year? I haven't even got in the car yet. And
Yeah,
they're already
exactly.
putting the pressure on me. And then, of course, Paul Aaron, who is also still a contender for the F2 championship, got that reserve driver at Alpine in the end, which reserve driver role at Alpine in the end, which, obviously rules out Colapinto for that. So, yeah, pretty crazy. I mean, the other thing to say about Colapinto is that he's on a Williams contract, which I believe is pretty tight. Not to say there isn't a buyout clause, but the fact there is a buyout clause, maybe the decision maker that Alpine and RB needed, or Red Bull really needed to go elsewhere, combined with those accidents. So it's a brutal world out there for a young upcoming Formula
Yeah.
One driver.
It is, and I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing with that as well is that I think there is a sense, just to go back to to close the loop really on the Red Bull thing. I think there is a feeling with Red Bull that they do suspect that maybe, even though they think they can get Perez out of this contract, there is a feeling they're going to have to pay something to trigger it, whether it's to downgrade his contract, whether it's to change the terms in it or something. And I think that plus Colapinto's buyout clause, I think that, and you stir all those things together, it kind of said it. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's such a shame when you get a taste of how good a driver is, and then suddenly it's like, well, there's no clear path back for that driver. So hopefully with Colapinto, I think his stock is still high enough. I think that next year, any teams that are looking for either an in-season replacement or someone for 2026, he should be top of the list for a lot of teams, shouldn't he? Because he's young, he brings with him that marketing prowess, and he's got that kind of exciting story to tell. So I'm with you. I hope it's not the end for him, but certainly 25 now seems very unlikely.
Yeah, and let's not forget 2 more seats in 2026. Not saying that
That's true.
put
Yeah,
Colapinto in a
yeah.
Cadillac yet, but it certainly opens up the market a bit if drivers move around as well. Okay, so let's focus on this weekend. We still have one championship to be decided, the Constructors' Championship, and it's come down to McLaren versus Ferrari. It feels like quite an old school battle there.
It does,
Two
doesn't it? Yeah.
teams that have a history of going up against each other. The last time Ferrari won it was in 2008, when McLaren was the main rival. 16 years ago. Last time McLaren won it was 1998, so
Yeah, which
26
is mad.
years ago. Which way do you think this pans out, Nate? Do you think McLaren hangs on, or will Ferrari have the results all go their way and take the title?
I'd love to say it's Ferrari, and I think that I've been thinking about this all day. I mean, the smart money says McLaren. Yeah, McLaren's. It's not like McLaren's car has kind of dropped off a cliff. I think they should on performance, be able to get this over the line. But I don't know. I think that there's such a lot riding on this. Both these teams didn't expect to be in this fight at all. McLaren come into it. We're all expecting them to kind of win it. They almost had one hand on the trophy in Qatar, and then Lando got his penalty. So I don't know. I don't know if you agree, but I think sometimes coming into this race, you obviously always want to have a points advantage. You never want to go in chasing. But I think the mindset becomes so interesting. And you mentioned 2008. That's the last time McLaren won any championship, because when Lewis Hamilton won, that year, Ferrari won the constructors, McLaren won the drivers. If you think back to that season, McLaren went into the final race being like, we just need to finish fifth, and Lewis just finished fifth. He finished fifth by the skin of his teeth. And you talk to people involved that day. I remember doing a feature for that race. They say that conservative mindset, even if you don't want it to, it can just subtly creep in, because you suddenly think, well, look, we don't need to do anything super crazy here, because we just need this position. So I think if that will naturally come into play. But I just think there's going to be so much riding on that in McLaren, and we've seen them this season, I think, maybe overthink on a few occasions, maybe bungle a few things they didn't need to get wrong. That, to me, is going to be the big decisive factor. I don't think performance of the car will be. I think they'll both be in a good position. But if we suddenly get something dramatic, if we suddenly get a late safety car, something like that, we've obviously saw that in 21. Obviously I don't want to get into the discussion about what happened in 21, but Abu Dhabi is a place where things can swing around very quickly. It's actually, the races can play out in a quite ordinary manner. But if we're talking about a position or two and it's hanging on a knife edge, then I would actually back Ferrari in that situation. I don't know why. I just think that there's kind of but I think McLaren feel like they should win this. Ferrari don't feel like they can, and that can be such a liberating feeling if you're Ferrari, going to a place being like, well, we could win the championship here, no pressure if we don't, but we can just be as aggressive as we want to be. And I think that Ferrari's strategic mindset this year has been so much better. I haven't quite worked out the permutations yet, so I think that McLaren can do it with like a third and a fourth, or maybe a fourth and a fifth, depending on where Ferrari finish, but still not beyond the realms of possibility when Mercedes looks so good, and when we know Max will be up there as well. So really difficult one to call. What about you? Do you think am I being too much of a tifoso there? Am I being too blinded as an old Ferrari fan?
No, I like that you're going with your gut feeling. You're not letting,
absolutely.
You're not letting the maths get in the way.
I was like, I'll leave the maths to someone else. I'm just going on pure vibes.
Well, okay, so here's what I've got in front of me. This is written down, so I believe it's correct. So at the moment, McLaren have a 21-point lead over Ferrari. So to guarantee the Constructors' Championship, no matter what, 24 points. But if Ferrari don't win the final race, because there's also the count back of how many races you've won, then they can do it with 23. So yeah, obviously the easiest way for McLaren to win this title is to win the race. 25 points, done, dusted, no arguments. But you're right. Strange things happen at final races of the season when championships are on the line. You only have to ask Fernando Alonso that about Abu Dhabi 2010.
That's another. Really and that will be on Ferrari's minds as well. Some things can swing around so quickly at that same place.
And to give a much more recent example, Qatar, the weekend, really everyone went there saying, well, this is McLaren's opportunity to get it done, to either put the final nail in the coffin, have it sorted, or be a kind of couple of points to do it in Abu Dhabi. And then the Lando Norris penalty came about, and all of a sudden they were outscored by Ferrari by 3 points over the weekend. That's including the sprint and the Grand Prix. So these things do change incredibly quickly. I still think that McLaren will get it done. I think they've had the most consistent car across different races this year, certainly in the second half of the year. Ferrari have made big steps, and I think McLaren's advantage over Ferrari will be much smaller, or possibly zero, compared to what it was in Qatar. I think the track is much more balanced between the two cars. But I do think Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, they've had such a good season. They've worked so hard. It genuinely means something to those two drivers. I'm sure it does to Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz as well. But those two, when they talk about it, it really does feel like this is a big thing for them. And you're right, it's a lot of pressure for the team. But also, I think McLaren can kind of go into it thinking, well, 2 years ago, no one thought we were going to be here, including themselves. Because at the start of 2023, they were nowhere. And I think they've got to look at it a little bit like that no matter what, at the end of this year, even if they do somehow bungle the championship in Abu Dhabi, they still come out as winners just because of the progress they've made. And perhaps with that attitude, they'll just go in and get the job done and get the points they need. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm back in McLaren, you back
And
Ferrari, but it's
yeah,
nice that, as has been the case so often, we go into a race not knowing.
yeah, and it has because so often when the championship's done, the drivers' championship is like, okay, there's a few dead rubbers left, but it really added that sense of intrigue to Qatar. And I think fans seem invested in it. I don't think fans always. No one's ever as invested as the drivers' championship, but because it's those two teams and because they're both very well supported teams, I think it's going to be quite a special occasion. And an interesting one as well because we've never gone into a finale this excited about a constructors. Like, oh, who is this guy going to get out ahead of so and so? And this driver is and also I'm sure nothing's going to happen. But if you're Lewis Hamilton as well, are you paying attention to all of this? Are you like, hey, I want to join the constructors champions? Are you not? I mean, there's all these things that fans can get themselves stuck into. I don't think Lewis is going to care either way. It doesn't change what he does next year, but it's just going to add to the spectacle so much. Every time Lewis is near one of them, everyone's going to be like, "Oh, look, Lewis is near the McLaren. Is he holding him up?" So I think that's all fascinating. And on your point about Lando, I think he definitely wants it as well. I think he's been stung a lot by the coverage of his season. I think he feels a bit hard done by about the fact that a lot of us have kind of poked holes in the fact that should he have been closer to Max, etc. Which I think there's a very good argument he should have been, but I can also see from his point of view. He's there looking at it like I've had this breakthrough season. I finally won races. I've established myself as a guy that can win, can take poles, can fight with Max. Maybe not beat him all the time, but can fight Max. And then there's all of this negativity around me, and I think that has really ticked him off. And yeah, and I think obviously the way Qatar, he was pretty upset with himself, wasn't he? So I think he's going into that weekend in that kind of mindset. But you're right, uncertainty is a great thing, and we're lucky to have it.
Let's just pick up on Lewis Hamilton because, yeah, you're right. I'm sure fans will read into what he's doing around McLarens and Ferraris throughout Sunday evening in Abu Dhabi. But of course, it will also be his final race for Mercedes. Um, it's been a weird end to this partnership, hasn't it? Because if you look back to Silverstone, there are all those emotions about that victory. It was a fantastic victory, and it was, of course, his first since the 2021, Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, but first since he lost out on that 2021 title in Abu Dhabi as well. So then it almost seemed like the perfect time to end on a high. But since it's gone down, and there's been some comments from Lewis about wanting to retire the car in Qatar, looking forward to Christmas, just want to get this season out of the way. It doesn't really feel like a fitting end to such a successful partnership, does it?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And there was also the kind of the weird comments he made. When was it when he said, "Oh, if this is the end for me, at the team," and 2 races ago, which obviously everyone jumped on, thinking, "Is he going to leave early or
So,
whatever?" Yeah, but that's it, Brazil, and it has been odd, and I don't know really. It's a frustrating one. Like in Vegas, I got the sense. I mean, I know Lewis was upset for losing, but it was kind of like, well, the issue was you didn't get qualifying right, and Russell did, and he ran off into the distance and he won the race, and yeah, I think it must be a difficult one for Lewis because I think on to look at it from his point of view, he's leaving this affiliation with Mercedes that he's had since he's a kid. I think that yeah, that high, you're right, that high of Silverstone was so high to then come down from that. And then he had Belgium, he won, but he didn't really win. He didn't celebrate the win. It was like, he got it because Russell got disqualified. So there wasn't that emotional release either. So yeah, I think it's natural. I think you've got a guy like Lewis who is so used to winning and so used to winning with that team. There's a lot of confusing feelings and emotions about it. But then on Mercedes' point side, I would be kind of ticked off over the past couple of weeks because I'd say like nothing has changed from their point of view. They're like, we offered you a contract. Maybe it's not the contract Lewis wanted. He's the one who's decided to go somewhere else. He's the one who said, I want to finish my career somewhere else, which totally understandable. It's Ferrari. It's got that pull, etc. But yeah, if you're Mercedes, you're looking at it and being like, well, what's your problem here? You're racing with us. You're finishing the season, and I I never believed that a team wants one driver to go slower than the other. But what's probably started to happen behind the scenes is the Lewis has been in less meetings, or he's been privy to less information that is going on around the development of the car. That happens when a driver's leaving, and that if you're not used to that, if you've never had that happen to you, or you've not had that happen to you for years, maybe it's a difficult thing to process and deal with. But yeah, it's a shame because this statistically is the best partnership of all time. It's better than Schumacher and Ferrari, and for it to end like this, I mean, it would be great if Lewis could get on the podium just to have that have that moment. But yeah, just given the form at the moment, and what was it he said in Qatar? He just said I'm slow, which I think John Elkann and Ferrari must have been looking at their contract and being like, well, if he is, let's make sure we got a get out clause here or something. But I don't quite believe that. But yeah, I think that Lewis sometimes when he gets in his own head, he can not. I don't think spiral's the right word, but it can kind of weigh him down a bit, can't it? We've seen that previously in his career, so I don't know. But he definitely looks like a man who needs to get away from a Formula One car and down to the beach and just chill for a bit, doesn't he?
Yeah, it must be tough being a Formula One driver. But I mean,
Yeah, well, there's that as well. You always are like, I can't feel too sorry for this guy. He's about to race for Ferrari. He's a seven-time world champ. So yeah, the sympathy's got to be limited.
no, I was told very early in my career, never feel sorry for a Formula One driver. It's
Great advice.
they don't have it that bad. But I think the other thing to point out is that Lewis has had genuine struggles with this car
Mm.
that go beyond anything. It's just the nature of this car, the nature of, in fact, this whole regulation set. It hasn't allowed him to basically do what he likes to do in a Formula One car. It hasn't given him the front end that he needs when he turns into corners, and his ability to exploit um, his natural talent and in turn getting the car turned in on the brakes and all of that. And so there's this kind of issue that he has had. George seems to have adapted to it much better, and it's left a gap between the two. And I think, Las Vegas was a perfect example where I think Lewis knew this was an opportunity. He was actually looking really quick in Q1, Q2, went to Q3 and put it all on the line twice and lost both times round. George put it all on line and got pole position. But yeah, I feel like that was almost like the perfect representation of the problems Lewis has had with his car. But then went and showed on race day that he's still more than capable. I don't think he's certainly hasn't got that much worse in the last 2 or 3 years, if at all, and he's still capable of pulling off remarkable results. So it's a shame that it's ending this way, but I guess perhaps it was always inevitable, because when you announce something like moving to another team in February, it's a long old slog with, like you say, a lot of things, confusing emotions going around in people's heads. I think it was probably very emotional immediately in the season, and then to drag that out over 24 races, longest F1 calendar we've ever had, one of the most brutal F1 calendars we've ever had in terms of the races at the end of the season, triple headers, this one, Las Vegas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi. It's particularly tough. I think for everyone, it kind of, it gets to a limit. Interestingly, just on kind of conspiracy theories and this belief that perhaps Mercedes in some way have kind of tried to, make basically give Lewis a worse car,
Yeah, bad send off. Yeah.
Toto talked about it in Qatar and said it's all well and good people hiding behind their laptops and all that kind of stuff, and that he essentially did just label it conspiracy theories. I honestly don't think there's anything in it either, because it's just this question of why would you? I mean, sure, there's always little things within every team that go one way or another. And prior to this season, at Mercedes, I think those things would always have gone Lewis's way, even when he was up against Nico Rosberg back in the day. And then this year, perhaps, a few of those tiny small things, whether it's just an update or, a slightly fresher part or whatever, might have gone George's way. But we're talking tiny margins, and the thing is, Lewis seems to have left enough quotes dangling on a Sunday night or a Saturday night when he's frustrated for people to latch onto it, but I don't personally buy into it.
And I think we're lucky as well, aren't we, with our job? We see the humans that are kind of behind every team. If you, it's all well and good being like, oh, Mercedes want him to lose, but it's like, well, there's a team full of guys on Lewis's side of the car that they have no interest. They don't care about all the whether Lewis is leaving or not. They just they're the same as us. They want to maximize their job. They get bonuses at the end of the year. They're not in some grand conspiracy to make your favorite driver's life a misery. So it's always nice for people. I think Toto's always been good on that with the laptop. He likes the idea of people behind their laptops, doesn't he? He says it quite often. But he is right. It's easy to sit there and think, oh, they're trying to ruin his race. But most of the people working on that car, are just ordinary guys that fly economy, are at the circuit super early. They leave super late. They're just working hard on the car. They've got no vested interest in in giving somebody a bad or a good send off. Either way, that they're just there to win. So, yeah. But you're right. Actually, it's a good point. Lewis is kind of. I think Lewis sometimes. I think he knows what he's doing when he kind of sprinkles those quotes out. He knows it's going to create some drama, and then he knows as well he's big enough and he's famous enough and he's sought after enough that at the next race he'll then be asked to talk about it, and he can then kind of, having had a few days to think about it, he can kind of give a more measured response. But yeah, I'm hoping. I mean, I remember Abu Dhabi's a good place for a send off. So hopefully, yeah, as long as no one mentions Michael Massey to him, I think we'll be okay.
Because if he doesn't turn up,
Yeah,
guess
yeah,
the wrong
yeah. Well, I mean,
handing
that
out
would be
trophies.
quite a turn if Toto Wolff unveiled him. Then we know things really have gone south between the two of them.
Yeah,
But
I don't think Toto's got any desire to see Michael Massey
yeah,
ever
yeah,
anytime
I
soon.
think that's the one thing they can be united on forever.
Yeah. Okay, let's just quickly touch on Qatar, throw it back a bit, because I think there's still a few things which people were either confused about or felt were not handled in the right way, mainly around the way the race was directed, and then also some of the stewards' penalties over the weekend. The obvious one, and Nate, you've got an article up about this because to give people a bit of like inside information here. So we had all these kind of controversies that there were a lot of questions floating around on Sunday night following the mirror on the track, why there wasn't a safety car initially, why it was then a stop-go penalty, basically the harshest one that you can deliver to Lando for ignoring the double wave yellows. And the FIA said to us on Sunday night, we understand there's a lot of talk about this. We're going to present you with some answers very shortly. The next message from the FIA about 4 hours later was, oh, by the way, we're not going to give that to you until the next morning. I woke up the next morning in Qatar, still nothing, had to go and get my flight. But then it dropped, and thank you very much, Nate, because you managed to pick it up. So what did the FIA tell us, and how did they justify the various decisions? Let's start with the Lando stop-go penalty, because I think that one's fairly straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I have to admit, I mean, we were talking during the race. I at the time wasn't sure. I thought this is incredibly harsh for not slowing under a double wave yellow. And I remember, I think I asked in a group chat, I was like, "Is that normally the penalty?" And you kind of came back and said, "What for not slowing under double wave yellows?" Because then when you actually write that down, you're like, "Yeah, that is a pretty severe breach of safety." I'm just trying to find the actual wording of it here, but that's what they said: serious compromise of safety from Lando Norris for not doing that. And if you go back and you actually look at this stuff, you can see quite clearly there's an onboard where Lando's going down the main straight. People have to be careful looking at this one as well. If you've been on Twitter recently, people are sharing the wrong one. They're showing one where he goes down and there's a light that comes on, I think it's the slippery track warning, which is a few laps before the yellow flag. The yellow flag when he turns onto the main straight, and you can clearly see the double wave yellow flag is on the entire way down the straight. And that's probably why Max was straight on the radio saying, check if Lando lifted, because he probably saw that Lando gained a bit of time on him. And yeah, those things are out, aren't they, for a very specific reason. It's not just to make the race fun; it's for safety. So I think that when they said that, and they also, I mean, the precedent was Kimi Räikkönen in 2017, Belgian Grand Prix did the same thing. The safety car one was a bit more interesting. I thought that their main argument was basically the safety car wasn't deployed because the debris wasn't on the racing line. And yeah, I suppose the punctures forced their hand there. The safety car one to me seemed like the clumsier one of the two. Looking back at it, I think there's definitely an argument that can be made. But then again, and I wonder what you think of this as you were on the ground. I do think that there's this kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing, because on the one hand, everyone was looking at that thinking, oh, there should be a safety car, should be a safety car. But if there had been a way the FIA could have removed that without a safety car, I'm pretty sure they would have opted for it. I think people don't like the idea of a race, especially a consequential race in the championship, being interrupted by a safety car. Then obviously what happened was there was a safety car, and Lando then gets his penalty, etc., and the championship picture looks a lot different anyway. What do you think about the safety? I haven't explained that perfectly either. I could read the bullet points out, but I don't want to labor the point too
No,
much. But
I have it here. So their kind of reasoning for the double wave yellows with the debris is that it's not normal. Sorry, the normal practice is for safety car not to be
that's it.
deployed if there is a small amount of debris and off the racing line. And the wing mirror from Albon's car was off the racing line. But this is where I think, and it's very easy to say this in hindsight, you're not in the race director's chair. You've got a perfect view of what happened afterwards and everything. But the difference here is that it was the pit straight. It's the only overtaking area
Yeah, that's true.
on the circuit. So it's quite normal for cars to be off the racing line there, with the use of DRS and pulling out. Obviously, Valtteri Bottas's car did eventually hit the mirror, and that was actually moving out the way for cars to come past because of blue flags. So I think it was in a dangerous enough position that it had to be removed. They do sometimes leave just debris on track if it's way, way, way off the racing line and not going to be an issue. And I don't think anymore, although this has definitely happened in the past, that double wave yellows would be enough for them to then send a marshal on. Whether they were at that stage preparing for a marshal to run on the track, and then they would have safety card it. They didn't say any of this in the explanation, which I was kind of hoping they would, but I was giving them the benefit of the doubt that where they were perhaps getting everything in place so they knew exactly what they could do to remove it as quickly as possible, and then either do a virtual safety car or a safety car to be able to remove it. The problem with the virtual safety cars, of course, is you don't bunch up the pack. The pack remains spread out. All the cars are going slower. So unless you have a natural gap in the cars, it's still quite dangerous to send someone out to go and get it. The FIA also said that
and that can go wrong pretty quickly, can't it? If you send a guy out, you never want a person on a live track. So
no, exactly, and we see this before with marshals when they run on track, even in safety car conditions. The adrenaline that's going through someone's body when they're going onto a track to sweep away debris or push away a car or whatever. You often see people just fall over because they're just, it's just such a shock to the system. I'm on a live racetrack. Remember, these marshals are volunteers. They're all very well trained, but they are still volunteers. And so there's a danger that you send someone out there and they tumble over, and then you're in a difficult situation. So you got to do it as safely as possible. So in my mind, they were always going to have a safety car at some point. So why not do it earlier? I think you're right. There was a bit of reluctance to do it because it was right on the pit window. So there was, the possibility that you do actually have a major impact on the race and what's going on. And then, there's this other thing, and this is pure kind of speculation and joining the dots and everything. But, brand new race director, Rui Marquez, been in since Las Vegas. And it's, one of his first big calls to make. And so perhaps he was just giving himself a bit of thinking time first and then making the decision. And then you come back to this point, well, is this the FIA kind of being caught out because they decided to sack Niels Wittig, with 3 races to go, perhaps. But, then you're kind of like, you're kind of moving down the line a bit. And I think a lot of people were very keen to push those things together and kind of say
conspiracy theories again, people behind laptops.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's so much conspiracy theory, but yeah, like, to conflate this, this one kind of really quite, small area in terms of race direction. We've seen much bigger clangers been dropped before by race directors, much more experienced race directors. So, I don't want to like blame the race director too much, but you do wonder, somebody who's just a little bit more used to the flow of it, being behind that seat and that button on a few more race weekends, whether they may have handled it differently. But look, it's the way it worked out. I think, and to go back to the original point, Lando absolutely deserved the penalty because there was no excuse. Like I said, went past the yellow flags. Not only was he flat out, he had the DRS open. That's you can't have that. And then is it an extreme penalty? Well, yes, it is, but it's also a rule that is entirely based on safety. And the minute you start saying, oh, well, we'll just give a 10-second penalty, drivers may take advantage of that, or it sets an awful precedent down the road. And not just for F1, but also for all the junior series. And, anyone that's been to a karting event knows how dangerous it can be if people don't obey yellow flags. So, that one's a cut and dry. I didn't have an issue with it. So,
and you can guarantee Lando probably won't be doing that again. That's also what a penalty should do, isn't it? Is be a deterrent as well as the rest of those guys now know if they see that, ease up.
Yeah, but I genuinely believe what Lando said, that he didn't see the flag. I mean, surprising, because not only do they have the flags, they also have a warning on the dashboard. Usually the team are already on them saying, there's a mirror X place and, or yellow flags are showing wherever. So, but, I'll take his word for it. And also he took the blame for it. He got out of the car and said, it was his fault, and he apologized to his team for the points that they dropped as a result of that. So, yeah, I think that's basically where we got to. So a bit of a messy race. kind of hoping that we don't get another one in Abu Dhabi, because then you do really start having these questions asked. But I think it's the kind of stuff that all of that stuff was more or less justifiable one way or another. It's just unfortunately all came together in one messy race.
I wonder with it's interesting what you said about the race director. I hadn't considered that, but I think you're spot on. And you're never going to get a Formula One race, are you, where the race director can make a decision free of the context of the race that he is watching? That's always going to be part of it. And I mentioned it earlier, but that was one of the things that was kind of underpinning what happened in 21 in Abu Dhabi was this desire for the championship season to go. If you'd taken the championship season out of the mix in 21, that race may well have just finished under the safety car. Like, okay, look, let's just go by the book here. Boom, boom, boom. Race is done, whatever. So it's interesting, isn't it? If we ever get to a stage where they can somehow take the race director or take that decision making almost away from the human being to a degree. I don't know if you're ever going to be able to do that, but obviously AI is they're already leaning into bits of that with the way they look at penalties and stuff like that. Fascinating call, because if there was a way to say that is a safety car right now, completely emotionless, completely free of what is going on the racetrack. Do you see what I mean? Like that should be a safety car, because a human being is always going to second guess, is always going to have a second thought of like, what is it? Should I? And especially if you're, like you say, you're new to the job, you are completely aware of what's happened to previous race directors, the pressure they've been under. Yeah, I think that independently of Roy Marquez, that is just a fascinating talking point. Generally, I don't know whether you're ever going to get decision making that is completely boom. That is what should happen, because you're always going to have the human being saying, "Well, is this the right call? I need to just make sure this is the right call." So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
interesting side.
it is always judgment calls, and that is part. It's the same with a
Same
referee
with a ref. Yeah.
on a soccer pitch, or refs in American football as well. It's the same thing. Like it's always got to be a bit of a judgment call. Yes, there's some things which are black and white in the rules, but something like that, there's judgment calls to be made. To be fair to the FIA, and it's not entirely clear how effective this has been, but they have given, or they have attempted to give, the race director far more support than the race director ever had over the last kind of 20 years or so, in terms of backup from their remote operations facility, in terms of comparing examples, in terms of keeping eyes across all things, in terms of track limits, and then it's also, of course, important to draw a distinction between the race director, who's directing the race, so all those little things with safety car calls and whether it's a red flag or not, that's all the race director, and then the decisions, which are down to the stewards, who should be independent from the FIA. They are appointed by the FIA, but they should act independently from the FIA. And even the race director can be brought in front of the stewards. It doesn't happen very often, but can happen. So yeah, I think it's important to draw that distinction, because I think often the race director gets a lot of blame for stuff that is a decision by the stewards. Again, judgment calls by human beings, panel of four, but absolutely nothing to do with the race director on many occasions. He may put stuff forward to the stewards for them to consider, but in theory, he shouldn't be part of that decision process on penalties. So, yeah, I think there's a few things that people sometimes get a little bit mixed up with, and and then this kind of overall feeling towards the FIA at the moment, both from the drivers, the teams, and F1, and I think fan base as well, shouldn't get mixed up with people who are actually doing a pretty good job race in, race out. Right. I mean, this could be a whole podcast, but we should probably move on.
Yeah, absolutely right.
We've got one good bullet point to finish on, which is sad in some ways. Esteban Ocon has raced his final race for Alpine. Not so sad, because we know he's going to Haas, and as part of this deal, he will get gets a test with Haas at the postseason test in Abu Dhabi. So there was a bit of a deal to be cut there. Jack Doohan, on the plus side, will get his debut, a kind of race zero for 2025. What can we expect from Doohan? I mean, is he going to do a better job than Ocon? Ocon's had a tricky few races, but what's behind this? What's driving this decision?
I'm not sure he'll do a better job, but it makes total business sense, doesn't it? You've got a guy that's coming in next season. Obviously, is part of your driver academy. You want that to be a success. Obviously, not that any team ever wants it not to be, but there's added emotional baggage there. And if they could do it, I don't see why they wouldn't. I saw a lot of people being very sentimental, like, oh, Ocon deserves a send off, and maybe he does deserve a send off, but in Formula One, you don't always get what you deserve in that sense. And I think that obviously for Ocon, it's it's not the ending that he's the guy that claimed their only race win there for them as a team. So yeah, it is a shame that he's leaving like that. But if you're Alpine and you're looking at it, you're like, look, Jack Doohan next year. He's going to start the season at the Australian Grand Prix. There's going to be insane coverage of him before that race. Race down under. His dad's Mick Doohan. He's an absolute legend down under. There's just going to be so much around that. And I think if you're Alpine and you can take away even just the sting of this is your first race, how's it feel? How are the nerves? He'll be able to cool on this race a little bit. So that'll be the hope. That'll be the aim. Obviously, we kind of alluded to it earlier. I think there was a bit of a question mark with some people around the Colapinto link and what it meant for Doohan. I don't think Alpine ever were considering replacing him, but it's just a good kind of reminder of like this is our guy going forward. They get to then test him in the race and the test afterwards. So I think you get two lots of information on him and bits to work on in the off season. So makes a lot of sense. Whether he'll do better, I don't know. I mean these young guys are so well prepared now, aren't they? They're kind of coming in and they're doing a great job off the bat. But yeah, it'll be interesting. And to be honest, that will be quite a good indicator for them to see how he measures up against Ocon. If he comes in and knocks it out of the park straight away, they'll go into the off season feeling really good about themselves and thinking, well, we've made a great call here to put Ocon in there. So yeah, I think logical call. I mean, what do you think? Do you think they've been a bit harsh? I mean, they've definitely been harsh with Ocon, but I feel like if you could make that call and it frees him up, it helps Ocon out as well. They could have not done this. They could have blocked him testing for Alpine before. We've seen Lewis isn't going to be testing for Ferrari. There's a few drivers that aren't going to be testing for the teams they're joining. They've at least helped him make that step, or at least that's the way it's been framed, to go test for Haas after the race.
Yeah, it's not been an easy end to Ocon's season. Obviously, he had the second place in Brazil, which was fantastic. Great gamble by the team on strategy and great execution by both drivers, Ocon in second and Gasly in third. But prior to that, he'd had 6 races without scoring a point at a time when Alpine was starting to come together. Obviously, Gasly looked much better in Qatar. And in a way, I think it does make sense to Ocon, I think, in some ways to get in that Haas for the postseason test, which it seemed like Alpine weren't willing to do unless he gave up Saudi Arabia. So gave up Abu Dhabi. So it's a bit of an ultimatum like put in front of him in that sense, which is perhaps a bit unfair, but
it's cutthroat. But it's a cutthroat sport, isn't it? And you kind of you can understand it.
And then the other side to all this, of course, is they're in a constructors battle of their own, Alpine. 5 points ahead of Haas, which is a more comfortable margin than I thought they were going to have, again, because Gasly scored big in Qatar. But I do wonder if Jack has a bit of a shocker and the car's actually relatively competitive and then they still lose out to Haas, they might wonder. But then I do wonder as well whether, of course, Ocon going to Haas next year, whether there was something in the back of their mind. They were saying, well, Esteban isn't really performing. Is there a reason for it? Is it because he's actually got his head fully into Haas? And so there's all these kind of things going around in the background. I think the team actually acknowledged that to some extent, but obviously it wasn't given as a reason. But the other thing is that at the very top of all this is that you've got a kind of Mr. Ruthless himself, Flavio Briatore, calling the shots. So it's perhaps not surprising at all that Jack Doohan, who is, I believe, like ultimately managed by Briatore as well, he would want to give his driver every possible opportunity to get himself in the best position possible for his debut next year. But yeah, look, I think it's always a bit awkward when drivers are leaving at the end of the season to go to another team, and if you have an opportunity to do this kind of thing, perhaps that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that. I think you've got to remove yourself a little bit from the emotional side of it. They're still running businesses at the end of the day. They're making decisions for the long term. And a bit like what we said with Lewis, they've known Ocon's leaving for a while. They don't owe him anything in terms of, they're paying him what is owed in his contract. They've obviously come to a settlement here. So I don't have a problem with it. Before we finished up, I had one question I was going to throw to you as you were on the ground in Qatar, and it was a big talking point. What was it like? And you don't have to give a full deep dive on it, but this simmering kind of tension between Max and George, I think, is fascinating going into this last race. We're probably going to be talking about it with both of them on Thursday. How do you know George Russell quite well, and we've both covered Max quite well. How do you think that's going to go down on Thursday when we kind of put these, especially Max's quotes to George? Basically, I mean, for people that didn't see that, him telling him to kind of F off, basically, to censor myself. How do you think that's going to go down? I'm sorry, this is completely out of kilter with how we were planning the show, but I just popped into my head when we were talking about this weekend and what there is to look forward to.
No, it was a fascinating one to cover from the ground, because it all boiled down to that penalty that Max got in
Yeah,
qualifying. And for Max, I think that pole position lap actually meant more for, of all the success he's had, that pole position lap really meant a huge amount to him. One, because it was his first in something like 11 races. I haven't got off the top of my head, but it was, 10, 11 races or so. And two, because of the turnaround that Red Bull had done during the weekend. His car was nowhere in sprint quali and in the sprint race. They took a bunch of gambles on strategy, went quite aggressive with the setup, went quite aggressive with the setup changes into qualifying, and Max got it right, absolutely got it right. And then, in his view, what he was doing, the reason why he was so slow in that point, why he held up George, was because he said he was being nice. He was making room for Fernando and Lando, letting them both through. It also, I think, boils down to different kind of ways that teams were preparing their tires. Max was like trying to, I think get them cool before he went. George was trying to put a bit of energy into them, and so you had this moment on track where George had to drive around him. It went to the stewards because Max had exceeded this kind of delta lap time that they need to stick to for safety reasons, so you don't have slow cars going around the track, and it exceeded it by a lot. I think it was about 18 seconds or something like that. So that happens fairly regularly in qualifying, and then we just get no further action because there's excuses around it, like letting two cars through in the final sector. But George, apparently, when they went to the stewards, was absolutely adamant that his qualifying lap had been slightly ruined, that Max had got in the way, that we had to go for the gravel, it could have been far worse and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know exactly what was said in the stewards room because sadly there's no cameras in there, but it sounds like George was really pushing for Max to get a penalty. And you might think, well, fair enough, because he stood to gain the most. He stood to start from pole position, and that's sometimes the way it goes. Certainly on team radio, you hear that all the time. I mean, we heard that in the race. Max Verstappen made sure the stewards were
about
aware
Lando,
that Lando Norris had gained time under the double yellow flags. But I think, judging by Max's reaction, it was just the lengths that George went to in the stewards room, and that what he said in the stewards room was perhaps different to what he was saying to the TV cameras and in the press conference when they were all together. And Max said that he'd lost all respect for George as a result
which
of
is
this kind of
remarkable thing to say. Yeah,
yeah, and I mean, I don't think they've ever been that close, those two. It's not like you kind of George and Alex Albon kind of relationship or anything like that. Or I guess Max and Lando before this year kind of, put a bit of an edge on that relationship. But yeah, surprising that he would use the language he did and be so clear cut about making a point about this. Because these were quotes that he didn't say on Saturday, because we didn't get a chance to talk to him on Saturday after the stewards' decision. This was all on Sunday after he'd won the Qatar Grand Prix. So, must have been in a fairly good mood. And so, yeah, he really let rip. So I think, one, I like this because it's just Max telling it like it is. I've got full respect for Max having, his own opinions on stuff and not being afraid to air them. But it is interesting as well, not least because George is the head of the GPDA. And when there was all this talk about racing rules, I seem to remember there was a quote which was put to Max at one stage that George said basically 19 drivers are all in agree, or in Mexico were all in agreement about it, and one driver wasn't. Obviously, he's saying that Max wasn't in agreement because Max was the one who was penalised in Mexico. And whether that kind of stuck with Max a little bit, and then this kind of really pushed him over the edge. But an interesting one because, hey, going into next year, I'd say sure, McLaren and Ferrari look best right now, but Red Bull and Mercedes are not that far away. And if Red Bull and
100%.
Mercedes are going into next year as potential title contenders, we could have Max Verstappen versus George Russell more often on track. And if there's this beef here now, I wonder whether that will spill over. I don't know. I mean, what you spent a bit of time with Max this year, kind of. I feel like at the moment this is the best Max we've ever had from a media perspective.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I would agree completely. I think that there's the kind of he's never been PR trained, has he, Max, really? And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean he's never shied away from saying stuff. But I think recently, especially I mean, he was, I love the image of him drinking beers and just, you know, kind of kind of talking about Zach Brown when, when he was getting drunk a bit on Dutch TV after Vegas after he won the championship. I think it is great. And I think one of the great things about Max is, when you go into a session with him, if you ask him a question, he will give you the most frank answer. You, there are some drivers you ask a question, you're like, oh, they gave me that, and it's probably not accurate. Max will tell you, even if maybe it's not the best thing for the team. And I think that they like that at Red Bull. They're like, that's just Max. He's going to say what he thinks. And yeah, I agree with you. I think this is this. I had a few texts from friends of mine, friends who a year ago were like, can't stand Max Verstappen. People texting me being like, I don't know what it is about Max at the moment. I'm loving him. I'm like, yeah, it's because he's just he's basically putting people on notice, and he's saying, I'm not going to stand for any of this stuff. I also learned, I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of there's a part of Twitter that is, I would say, George Russell haters. And they, instead of saying GR63, which is obviously his initials, his number, they've coined the name PR63 because he is the opposite to Max to a lot of people. He's very media trained, I think comes across, he comes across very well spoken, doesn't he, George? But you do get that sense sometimes with him. You're like, oh, I wonder, a lot of thought has gone into his answer. And I'm not saying Max doesn't think about his answers. I think he does, but he doesn't try and think about a way to say something he doesn't mean. He will just put it out there on the line. So I think that's been quite interesting. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's great when drivers have that edge between them. We saw 21 as soon as Lewis and Max, that there was that tension there. The season got amazing. Lewis and Nico, to use an example, then just think it adds something. I think, and we have these kind of little digs from Lando and Max as well about each other that kind of keep going back and forth. So I think it's good. And yeah, I'll actually be the one in Abu Dhabi as well. I was asking you what you think it will be like, but I'm not sure if they're both in the press conference. But I think that'll be great. I think it'll be one of the best press sessions of the season. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, I look forward to hearing your questions. I believe you're packing your bags and flying off tomorrow.
Yeah, I am.
So,
Yeah, my bag is actually unpacked behind me, so that's my next job after this. So
right, okay. Well, we'll better let you get to it.
Yeah.
All to say is thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you after Abu Dhabi.